Hello everyone, I'm Professor Paul Carrier, and what I'd like to do now is to provide some information on the third element of contract formation, consideration. Remember where we are. We're still in the area of contract formation. In week one, we covered the first element, or the offer. And as you recall, it included things like the components, current intent, for example, communicated, etc., etc. The following week, week two, we began consideration of the second element, and that is acceptance. And in week two, the acceptance as well has three components: current intent, communicated, and either responsive or mirror image rule, which covers the nature of how an offeree must go through the process of accepting based on what the offeror expects. In week three, we were still in the area of acceptance, and we covered things that might have been responses, but they were not responsive. They were not or did not constitute an acceptance. An example is a mere inquiry, whereas, as an example, I'll sell you this for $300. Would you take $200? That doesn't reject an offer, but it's not an acceptance. Okay? The week after that, last week, would have been week four. We were still in the area of acceptance, and the main topic there was when or how the law likes to treat acceptances when the offeror is not clear on exactly how the acceptance must be formulated, must be delivered, must be manifested. And the hope is that there's a little bit more flexibility to save agreements rather than have the agreement fall apart for lack of quote-unquote acceptance when there are some small differences in the acceptance that are not quite as expected or explained in the offer. Okay? Well, now we're in the third element of contract formation, which is consideration. We will cover consideration as well next week, and at least for a certain period of time in the week that follows, week 7, after which point we move out of formation and into our next major category, which is breach. Following that, we will go into damages. Okay? So, with regard to consideration, you always want to be asking yourself three main questions, and treat these as questions regarding black letter law. These are things that you must know, and many questions, for example, on an essay will assume these, and you don't need to go into these issues. Other times, these are in fact the issue, and so if you remember these main questions, these main requirements, it keys you into what perhaps you might need to be writing about, or you might need to be thinking about as you're looking for the best choice in a multiple choice question. Okay, so there are quite a few examples, and there's some rules and sub-rules, but don't forget to always start with the very basics, which many people call black letter. The first question is, what is consideration? Why do we need it for a contract? And the answer is that for there to be a contract, there has to be something that each side wants from the other. I give up the money, you give up the guitar. I promise to paint your house and do a good job. You promise to pay me money. Each side has, you could say, it's skin in the game, right? And there's a Latin phrase that lawyers love to use, and so you should be familiar with it. It's quid pro quo, or what for what. I could say, I'll sell you this guitar for $300 if I want to. Well, what does want to mean? I have the choice of either buying the guitar or not buying the guitar. And if that's my choice, I could choose the one that doesn't mean anything, doesn't give you anything. You're going to learn next week that that would be an illusory promise. That is not proper consideration. Okay? If I turn over money, or I turn over my ukulele, and you cut my lawn or you give me your guitar, each side has given up something. I will warn you early about one Florida-specific rule, which will be covered again next week, but you may as well know this one. And other jurisdictions follow this too, but not all of them. Sometimes you don't need to have something positive go to the other side. Florida and other states agree that if you actually bargain for a detriment, you have got what you wanted. Example, if you don't drink or smoke for a year, I'll give you money. Well, if you don't drink or smoke, that's good for your health. But what do I get out of it, right? It's not you giving me money. I have a good feeling that you're on the right road to salvation. but that's not really what we ordinarily consider consideration. However, if that is what I wanted, if I really wanted that performance from you, right? And the benefit's really for you, not so much for me. As long as the other side gives up something, which he or she could do, drinking or smoking, and the other side bargains for it and really wants it, that's the bargaining for illegal detriment by the other party. That in Florida and in at least, I think the majority of other states, would be consideration. There are a few states that would look to see that some benefit went to each side. Okay? Now, in a way, consideration also proves the bargain. How do you know that I promised to paint your house? Well, why would I have promised you $3,000 or $4,000 if you didn't promise to paint my house? There's no reason. So the consideration is actually proof that the sides were negotiating and probably reached a bargain. Okay? So treat it as an element. It must exist in some legally sufficient, legally recognized form. Okay? But look for it on both sides, and don't forget the Florida rule. If one side doesn't really get its own benefit, but it truly bargained for someone else's detriment, like you don't drink and you don't smoke for 1 year, Florida will uphold that. Okay? And if you need something to latch onto, then the good feeling that that person gets for having you not drink or smoke would be the consideration in that particular factual scenario. Okay? Ask yourself, what qualifies as consideration? We know that it needs to exist. Now, what works? The easiest one is money. Of course, money. A check that will not bounce. Those kind of things are consideration. Coffee cup. Here's $5. I want a coffee cup. Some kind of good, some kind of item. A promise. I promise to paint your house and do a good job. If I do not do that, you could sue me for that breach. That promise with that underlying legal obligation is in fact consideration. Forbearance. If you give up the right to sue me, if you give up the right to drink or smoke, forbearing the continuance or going through something that's legally possible, if you forbear to do that, that is a sufficient form of consideration. Okay? So all of those can qualify. There is actually quite a good restatement second on contracts listing things that typically constitute consideration. So again, acts or performances, money, goods, forbearance, or giving up a right that one otherwise had the right to exercise, all of those can be consideration. So first, we just talked about the why. Now we just talked about the what. And let's now get to the specific legal standard of the what. We've talked about categories or kinds of what. Now let's talk a little bit more deeply about the legal test for it. You know you need consideration, the quid pro quo. You know quite a few things do qualify as consideration on each side. Each side has to have its own consideration going to this bargain. But now let's ask the legal question of looking at something to determine whether or not, at least in this case, it is appropriate consideration. Sometimes a coffee cup may not be consideration. What if I promised you $1 million for your coffee cup? No. I mean, the coffee cup for $5 is consideration. A coffee cup for $1 million indicates something that's probably not a contract. It's a gift, it's a bribe, but it's not appropriate consideration. So when you're looking at consideration, to look at whether or not it qualifies. Is it one of these things for which we can find quid pro quo? You ask yourself, is it legally sufficient? And courts very much like to stop after that question. They see $10 and a coffee cup. They see a promise to pay $3,000 and the promise to paint a garage. Those are relatively readily ascertained as legally sufficient. There's no problem with those. They don't look weird. It's a natural form of a contract and contractual relationship where there's something given on both sides. And so once you find this legal sufficiency, the courts typically believe that the question is answered, consideration has been met, and then it's time to check other factors for example, the fourth element, which we will get into in about 2 more weeks. Okay, let's just say you have something that is maybe insufficient. Let's say that there's a huge disparity in value, like $1 million for a coffee cup. Who would contract away $1 million for a coffee cup? Okay, that just doesn't make sense. There are a variety of reasons why that might happen. Maybe it is a hidden gift. Maybe it's a bribe. It's not really giving me the coffee cup. It's giving you $999,995, right? And the coffee cup is just fluff, but I'm trying to make it look like a contract for some reason, like to avoid taxes, to hide value, or to otherwise do something illegal. Maybe, like I said, it could be a bribe. Okay, so if you see something that doesn't feel right, the disparity in value is huge. You go beyond the legal sufficiency question, and you ask, well, there's such a disparity in value, something else might be going on here. I'd better make a deeper factual inquiry. And that's not to say it still might not be legally adequate. It might be. If the person who gets something that seems to be much lower in value, but really wanted that, then it might be okay. And perhaps the best way to make this point on legal adequacy is by an example. If someone offers you $1 million for a soda in the cafeteria, something is wrong, because the cafeteria is filled with all kinds of sodas, none of which costs $1 million. And so whatever that person is doing and handing over nearly $1 million just for your soda, one thing we can say is it's not a contract. It's something, bribery, gift, tax evasion. There are reasons why those kind of things go on, okay? But you can tell that's bizarre. I could use the very same facts, add a little bit more of a fact, and then you would agree with me that maybe it is legally adequate because it was truly wanted. What if you were offered $1 million for a soda from somebody who was just crawling out of the desert in an advanced stage of renal or kidney failure with lack of liquid? This soda might save that person's life before the paramedics get there. And so $1 million for a soda that might save somebody's life, if the person is wealthy and has $1 million to spare, might in fact be truly bargained for and truly wanted. It's $1 million or I die. I need that soda. I need the liquid into my system before I overheat and die of renal failure. So $1 million in the soda in a cafeteria? Probably not. $1 million as you're crawling out of the desert, no store in sight, you're in an advanced stage of kidney failure, and if you don't drink that soda, you're going to meet your maker. Maybe it would be. So now you see what we saw. We said, well, a Coke for $1 or $2 or a Pepsi, whatever product you like, would be legally sufficient for maybe $2. Those make sense. Money for an object, a sales item, perfect. But a huge amount of money for a relatively worthless product, at least when you look at the values, do you see that huge disparity in value? That should make somebody want to stop, drop, and roll. I don't think that's a contract. I don't think there's really a quid pro quo. Something else is going on. And so you go beyond the legal sufficiency question and you go into the legal adequacy question. Okay, don't go in there. If the values are reasonably in order, stay with legal sufficiency and don't go further. And mention that in an essay, by the way. Since the consideration looks legally sufficient on both sides, the courts don't need to go into the question of adequacy. However, if it's a little fishy, for example, large disparity in value, you ask adequacy and you go deeper into the facts to see the why. Did that person really want that, and was it really a contractual relationship? And if it was, fine, you can say legally sufficient, it was questionable. But when we looked into more of the facts, we believe that it was, in fact, legally adequate. Consideration is established, the third element is established. If, however, it smells more like tax evasion, a bribe, a gift, or some other strange but non-contractual thing, then it's not even legally adequate, and you could say that consideration has failed, and if one of the elements of a contract formation fails, for example, consideration, then there is no contract between the parties. At best, they are still in the negotiating phase.